Desire exists because of trauma. Now, trauma may sound like something awful, like a horrific event that may happen to somebody. But in fact, it's actually more subjective. It tends to work different from person to person. Now, when I'm discussing your trauma, I'm not talking about this typical understanding you tend to get from it. But trauma is something that everybody's experienced. Trauma is essentially fragmentation. In this video, what I want to give is not only just explanation of trauma, but to give you a very basic introduction towards the graph of desire from Lacan. Because if you understand trauma, you will understand an important part of the graph of desire. But let's get very back here at this point in time and just discuss what trauma means. And for this we have to understand a very basic concept, and that's about the signified and the signifier. Now what the signifier is pointing at a point, where it's the board tries to represent something. The signified is the object that we're referring to. Now when you're speaking about trauma, let's say a person tends to get very terrified when they hear a certain sound, or they tend to get really afraid when they see a spider. What they're usually afraid of isn't the spider or the sound, but we're afraid is of the meaning of the spider instead of the spider, because the meaning is what we associate from it. Now, what trauma is essentially suppression. Now, when you're talking about suppression, what usually gets suppressed isn't the memory of an event, but it's the meaning that the event had. Because we want to avoid the meaning, we will do everything just to get rid of it. And this avoidance, this trying to run away from one's luck, is in fact the very desire. So one of the reasons why you may want something really badly is oftentimes usually due to trauma. Not necessarily talking about physical needs, but essentially one of the greatest inspiration a person tends to face is usually the experience that they had gone through. This is what, for example, a lot of leaders tend to aspire, or a lot of people who tend to pursue a really lofty career or goal. It's what they're referring to when they tell their story and why something matters. Now, for Lacan, trauma isn't necessarily a linear process. It's not just an event in childhood that got simply suppressed and you just try to avoid the memory altogether. In fact, the very way Lacan tended to explain the experience of trauma in his 14th seminar, The Logic of the Fantasy, is through a three-stage process on that memory is built. The first is the very repression, from where the very origin of this memory begins. Now, when an experience is suppressed, we don't necessarily experience it as a trauma. The trauma experience comes only after it, once you begin to retroactively reflect on the experience that happened. Now, when we reflect on an experience, it isn't necessarily a conscious one. In fact, usually when people are brought into a situation that invokes a lot of emotional experience towards something, they usually just try to avoid the emotion. They don't want to seem too emotional, they don't want to get really deep to it, but they just want to go by in life. What's interesting though, when we try to avoid a certain experience, it creates almost this repetition. And that means the meaning of the trauma changes itself by the very experience that you had. Now I give you a very common phrase that you may hear around philosophy, and that is, you don't enter into the same lake twice, or you don't enter into the same river twice. Now even if you may go to the very same river, it isn't always the same experience. So, like with trauma, if you tend to re-experience a certain situation, it won't always be the same as you experienced in the first place. The same it isn't the same experience as to go down one way that you don't know, but once you know a way how to go to a workplace or to a place, Once you go down this road, the very experience that you tend to have going down this road will be a very different form that you tended to have in the beginning. Now, retroaction, or the part of recovering from a trauma, is instead of trying to avoid the experience that we tend to have, it's by looking back into the repression to figure out from where this emotion tends to come from the first place. Now, how can you know whether you have a trauma? It's very simple. You know you have a trauma when you tend to experience deep emotions. In fact, emotions are the messenger of the subconscious mind. It's the thing that we experience that we don't have words for it. It's the thing that exists beyond the verbal understanding. Now when you say, I want to explain you how I feel, you don't just share the feeling, the sound, and the very experience. Because you can share experience, but you can't share words. So if you want to tell someone how you feel, you first of all have to translate the emotion by changing it up so the other person can be brought into the position of experiencing it. But you can never be really sure that the other person is really understanding you. But you can be sure that you feel experience, that you are being understood by the other person. Now what trauma has to do with desire is that desire is what enables you to maintain the suppression of this one event in the first place. In fact, the very graph that you may see in Lacan is this upper part where you see the first hour going through, that is the time and the experience. And then once the very first signifier in the memory tends to come to be associated and goes down over this experience, it reminds you of the signified, which is the trauma. All this is happening in the first place to maintain this desire. We need trauma in order to maintain desire on a psychological level. In fact, for the entire psyche to be operating, we need a mechanism that keeps it going, which is essentially desire. And by knowing this very important aspect of desire, you now understand one of the very fundamental ideas and basis of that desire tends to operate itself. Now, knowing that isn't the full picture, but at least now you know, when you're talking about trauma in a Lacanian sense, that which we are talking about. Thanks for watching.